All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to unravel a really fascinating, but also tragic public health mystery. It comes from the gold mines of South Africa, and it's all about how a very specific idea of manhood, one that was built to survive unbelievable danger, ended up becoming a deadly threat all on its own. It all starts with this one single staggering number. Back around the late 1990s, in a mining town called Carltonville, researchers estimated that a full 25% of the mine workers there were infected with HIV. Just let that sink in, 1 in every 4 men. So that just begs the question, right? How could a community of men whose entire lives revolved around physical strength and toughness be so incredibly vulnerable to this epidemic? Well, the answer is way more complex and honestly more human than you'd probably guess. To even begin to get our heads around this, we have to go where they went, every single day. We've got to go deep, deep underground and understand the brutal reality they were living. I mean, the pressure these guys were under was just relentless. Imagine working up to 3 kilometers, that's almost 2 miles, straight down into the earth. You're dealing with insane heat, choking dust, constant noise, just complete and utter physical exhaustion. And then, at the end of the day, you go back to these overcrowded single-sex hostels hundreds of miles away from your family. So what's left to do? For many, life boiled down to drinking, sex, and work. This wasn't a place designed for living. It was a place designed for labor. But for all of that physical hardship, the biggest stress, the thing that really dominated their minds, was something else entirely. It was the constant, nagging, inescapable fear of dying. Suddenly, violently. And listen, this was not them being dramatic. Just hear how one miner put it. So that lamp on his head, it wasn't just a tool to see. It was a reminder, a symbol that every single trip down was a roll of the dice. This kind of thinking, this fatalism, it just became a core part of their reality. Death and serious injury weren't some abstract risk. They were happening around them all the time. So how can you possibly worry about some long-term health plan when you're not even sure you'll make it through the day? And what all of this does, psychologically, is it just completely strips away your sense of control. What psychologists call self-efficacy, that basic belief that your actions matter and that you can affect your own future. And that feeling of powerlessness, that is the absolute key to understanding everything that comes next. So, okay, you're powerless, you're terrified. How on earth do you cope with that every single day? Well, you build a shield. They created this incredibly specific, really powerful social identity, a unique kind of masculinity designed for one thing and one thing only: survival. Picture this. A new worker shows up. He's young, probably terrified to get in that cage and drop down into the earth. The older, experienced miners, they'd pull him aside and teach him the code. They tell him, to survive down there, you have to be a man. And what that meant was you had to be brave, you had to be fearless, and above all, you had to swallow all of it, to provide for your family back home. It was a mental suit of armor. And this whole idea, this identity, was all wrapped up in this one pretty haunting metaphor. It's something they'd say to each other to toughen them up or to comfort them. A man is a sheep. He does not cry. A man is a sheep. What does that even mean? Well, the meaning is actually pretty brutal when you hear it explained. It meant that a goat might cry out when it's in pain, but a sheep endures everything in silence. To be a man in that mine meant you had to be the sheep. You endure any pain, any fear, and you show absolutely nothing. But this is where the story takes its tragic turn. This is the dangerous bargain, because that psychological shield, the very thing that helped them survive the daily horror of the mine, it was about to become a weapon turned against their own health. This one quote just bridges the gap perfectly. You see, being a man wasn't just about what you did underground. It came with a whole set of expectations for what you did on the surface, too. It was a package deal. And this is where that bargain really comes into focus. On one side, you have the shield, the survival tool, right? The bravery, the stoicism, the sense of duty to family, all things you need to get through the day. But on the other side, you have the sword. That very same identity demanded that a real man had insatiable sexual urges, needed multiple partners, and insisted on flesh-to-flesh sex, which meant no condoms. You couldn't have one without the other. They were two sides of the exact same coin.
So this whole identity created a belief system that basically justified all this risk. They had another saying, a man is a dog, which framed his sexual appetite as this natural, uncontrollable force. And really, think about it. When your biggest fear is a ton of rock falling on your head today, the threat of a disease like AIDS seems so distant, so abstract. The real danger was down below. Pleasure was the reward up on the surface.
But if we stop the story there, we're missing the most important part, the most human part. Because underneath all the layers of danger and this tough guy identity, there was a deeper, more universal need driving this behavior. You know, we know from tons of research that there's this powerful connection between social support and risk-taking. When people feel connected and cared for, they tend to make safer choices for themselves. But when people feel isolated and lonely, they are far more likely to engage in risky behaviors. And for these minors, living a life of extreme stress, danger, and just profound loneliness, hundreds of miles from their families, unprotected sex started to mean something more. It took on a whole new, deeper meaning. Ultimately, that flesh-to-flesh contact, it wasn't just about physical pleasure. In a world that was hard and cold and isolating, it became a powerful symbol of human connection, of warmth, of all the things that were so desperately lacking in their day-to-day lives. This quote from a minor suffering from a chronic illness, it's just heartbreaking. It cuts right through everything else. He's not talking about medicine or doctors. He's talking about the absence of his wife. He directly links his poor health to his loneliness and his lack of care. This is the human cost of that isolation. And so we arrive back at the central, tragic irony of this whole story. The masculine identity, the shield that was so essential for coping with the threat of death in the mines, was the very thing that led them directly into the path of another deadly threat on the surface. And this story, it really leaves us with a much bigger question, doesn't it? How often do we judge people's health outcomes as simple choices without really understanding the incredible pressures and the dangerous environments that shape who they have to be? It forces us to ask, how much of our health is really defined not by our choices, but by the identities we have to build just to survive?